Chapter 20. 8 figures dashed through the open, barren plains of the former Los Padres National Forest. Yet to reach the dense masses of large trees further south, the group was able to move quickly, choosing speed over stealth. They were on the clock and needed to be back before Skynet found a way to regain control of Serrano Point and redistributed power away from the TDE. Savannah ran up at the front in point position and set the pace for the rest of the group. She ran quickly, stretching her stride further and further and pushing herself as hard as she could. Her calves and thighs burned from exertion, and her chest ached as she sucked in each shallow breath, becoming harder and harder to get the air she needed with each stride. They'd been on the move for over 24 hours now since leaving Serrano Point, and running through the woods for just over 2 hours, 10 or 12 miles, she reckoned. Though she'd have to ask Cameron to be sure, and right now she barely had the breath to speak a single word while she was still moving. "Savannah, stop," John called out from the rear position, blurting the words out of his aching, parched throat and burning lungs. He and Cameron had elected to cover the group's tail end, mostly to alleviate Derek and his group's concerns that he'd simply leave them if anyone fell behind. Savannah slowed down and halted, stopping the rest of the group behind her. "Rest for 5 minutes," John told them all. Several of the group leaned over double and panted heavily, struggling to get their breath back. Allison pulled out one of her canteens and took a long swig of water, gulping it down in long, slow mouthfuls. Despite the cold, she was sweating from exertion and was sorely tempted to splash some over her face to cool down, but she knew if she did, it would suffer in the long run. She looked back north in the direction of Serrano Point, far away now, a day's marching away. Tears formed in her eyes and started to roll down her cheeks. She reached up and wiped them away, but knew that wouldn't be enough. Cassie nuzzled her legs and rubbed her face into her thigh as she let out a low whine. Allison crouched down and pulled the dog into a hug, receiving a series of licks to her face in return. Cassie always seemed to know when something was wrong with Allison and was always there to comfort her. "Kyle," Allison whispered under her breath. She just couldn't believe he was gone. They'd grown so close lately. She'd never felt anything like what she had for Kyle before. She wished more than anything she could have taken his place, been the one hit instead of him. She was going back to the past, but it wouldn't be the same without him. The plans and ideas they'd had for a bright and shining future that now just seemed dull, hollow, and empty. It wouldn't be the same without Kyle. She wouldn't be the same without him, not now. Derek, too, was in mourning, though he hid it well. He crouched down on one knee and kept watch to the south, looking out for any signs of machines coming to intercept them. The tin can had said it had cut off Skynet's communications in the plant, but he wasn't going to just take its word for it, especially not after it and Connor had left 4 of his friends behind and just gotten Kyle killed. "We should have gone for Mexico," he shook his head. They'd have cleared the border easier than this and would be far in the south of the country by now, either in one of the national parks or even further down, where the chances of growing food would be better. He didn't blame Connor for Kyle's death, however. He'd lost enough people over the years to know sometimes things just happen. It couldn't have been helped. That didn't make losing his brother any easier, but nor would blaming anyone. Kyle would have died for nothing if they didn't get back and stop this shitty future from happening all over again. Cameron watched Savannah stood motionless, clutching her rifle and staring out into the distance. She looked to Allison and saw the tears rolling down her cheeks, and then back at Savannah, her face was blank, much like a machine's. Her posture wasn't slumped like Allison's, and even Derek's. Her eyes weren't sad, nor was she crying. She had the same look in her eyes Cameron had seen in resistance fighters in her future that'd been through especially traumatic experiences. They'd called it the 1,000-yard stare. Why isn't she crying? She asked John. She'd always thought people cried when they were upset, She'd seen John cry several times, and Sarah too on occasion. John saw little more than Cameron did, being more familiar with what Savannah must be feeling. "She's bottling it up," John said, remembering what Ellison had told her before and what Savannah herself had said about keeping a lid on things. "Like I did after my birthday." Cameron understood that. John had avoided facing what had happened after she'd turned bad. He hadn't wanted to talk about it. She didn't understand why people did that when it was more harmful in the long run. But people weren't logical. It was one advantage they had over Skynet. It made them unpredictable. "She's punishing herself," John told Cameron as he watched Savannah stood sentinel, completely motionless. "That's why she ran, everyone ragged through the forest." "It wasn't her fault," Cameron said. John shook his head and realized Cameron still had a lot to learn about people. "It doesn't matter. She lived with Ellison for years, just the two of them. Survivor's guilt. He's gone and she's still here." It didn't make sense to Cameron, but she accepted John's word on it. John looked out at the scene all around them. They were surrounded in all directions by miles and miles of hills and valleys, stretching out endlessly to the horizon and bathed in the blood-red glow of the setting sun. The desolate, deserted, and dead wilderness seemed to go on forever and reinforced the sense of complete isolation. They were in this alone, and nobody was coming to help them. "How far have we gone?" he asked Cameron. 93 miles, Cameron replied. She didn't bother reciting an exact decimal figure. It wasn't necessary. She'd learnt that sometimes with human interaction, less was more. 69 miles to go, she added. The last part of the journey would be the most dangerous. Back through the Angeles forest and the dead trees, crossing the main supply route once more, and returning back to LA County. They would have to move underground again when they approached more built-up areas. John pulled his radio out and switched it once again to Weaver's frequency. "Weaver, come in." The interior of the remnants of Zyra Corp's basement was completely still and silent, devoid of movement or any signs of life. If a person were to randomly enter the room, they would see a decrepit, abandoned room full of dust, decay, and debris, and would likely leave as quickly as they'd come, having seen the room was empty of anything remotely valuable. 4 walls, relatively intact ceiling and floor, and not much else. The only item of curiosity in sight was a single radio on the floor by the wall, as if forgotten by someone in their haste to leave. That and a small bloodstain on the floor were the only signs that anyone had ventured into the basement any time recently. "Weaver, come in." The radio squawked as the voice came through, garbled slightly by the concrete blocking some of the transmission, resulting in a static, grainy transmission. One of the walls suddenly changed color from a drab, dirty beige into gleaming chrome silver, and began to run down like thick liquid. It oozed down like thick treacle onto the ground, raising up from the floor and taking shape, colors and textures changing, metamorphosing into a tall, striking brunette woman. Where the wall had been was now a large, gaping hole. Inside it was the tall shape of the electromagnet, as well as the laptop, a series of wires and cables, and a single bloodied corpse. Catherine Weaver reached down and picked up the radio. "Yes, John," she replied. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. "We've rerouted the power from Serrano Point. How are the repairs coming?" "They're complete," Weaver said. "That was fast." Weaver smiled, slightly more, a slight upturning of one corner of her mouth, as her eyes held no mirth whatsoever. "Without being distracted, it went quicker than I expected." She stepped over the dead body in the hole in the wall, a tunnel rat who'd stumbled into the basement as she'd been working on the TDE, and been quickly disposed of with a single stab to the heart. "What's your condition?" she asked him. "We lost a few people. Ellison's gone. We're on our way. We'll be back within 24 hours. "I'll be ready," Weaver replied flatly. She turned off the radio and opened up the laptop, taking it out of standby. She activated the TDE basic functions and ran a diagnostic program she'd already run one, but she was nothing if not thorough. The diagnostic ran a number of tests by itself, and Weaver simply waited for it to finish. It didn't take long, and she quickly read the findings. All systems were functional, and there were no issues with the TDE or the buffer she'd created. A message box appeared on the screen. All systems functional. No errors found. Enter temporal coordinates. Weaver typed the date into the temporal coordinates. October 15th, 2009, 2 weeks after they'd left for the future. Once she'd input the coordinates and pressed enter, the screen changed to another dialog box. Temporal coordinates confirmed, 15-09 to 2009. Press enter to initialize time displacement equipment. She pressed enter again, and a number of LEDs on the electromagnet immediately winked to life. A low humming started up from all around as the other buried electromagnets all activated, and the superconductors started to build up a charge. The buffer she'd created winked online as LEDs and lights came on and off and flashed periodically. Another dialog box appeared on the laptop screen. This one had a status bar that ran across most of the screen. Insufficient power to activate. Switching systems to buffer. Estimated time until TDE buffer reaches optimum charge. 25 hours, 4 minutes. She was actually rather satisfied that some of the humans allied with John had been lost. Fewer people meant less resistance when they realized the likelihood that they would, in all probability, only have enough time for one transition back, and there was only limited space inside the sphere. She, Cameron, and John would return to 2009. There would be little room left in the sphere after, perhaps enough for one person. She'd never seen what would happen if part of a human or machine remained outside the sphere during the temporal transition. Either the bubble would collapse and nothing would happen, or said body part would be severed. Either way, John's promise to take the others back would be a broken one. It wasn't her intention to leave the others in the future, but it was a matter of priorities. She, Cameron, and John mattered. The others did not. Their past selves could still be saved if they prevented Skynet. The future incarnations were irrelevant. John went over to Savannah, and Cameron followed behind him. He pulled out his canteen and took a long swig of the water inside, grateful for the liquid soothing his parched throat. They'd really needed this rest stop, he realized. He stopped next to Savannah and watched her staring out to the horizon, but she didn't even seem to register him approaching. He hesitated for a moment, not sure of what to say. He'd cried when Charlie had died. The man would have been like a father to him if he'd had the chance to, but this wasn't on the same level, and he knew it. What can I say to her? She lived with Ellison, day in day out, for 18 years, and now he's gone. He realized there really was nothing he could say to help her, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. He looked around and saw Allison with Derek, Cooper, and the others. She at least had her other friends to grieve with. Savannah had no one. "I know it won't help," John said as he stepped up to her and put his hand on her shoulder, "but I'm sorry." He really meant it too. Ellison, with Savannah, had dedicated their entire lives to getting him back to the past, and now he'd made the ultimate sacrifice to make sure it had happened. To his surprise, Savannah didn't react the way he'd thought she would. No violent moves or snapping his hand clean off the wrist. She just remained still, looking out into the endlessly rolling rocky hills to the south. "Me too," she said meekly, her voice croaking slightly. She was the only one, besides Cameron, who hadn't drank or eaten anything yet whilst they were resting. She looked at John, and he saw the hardness in her face cracking, just for a moment, and he saw the vulnerable, sad little girl he'd met nearly 2 decades ago. "I'm gonna miss him," John told her honestly. Savannah nodded at John slowly. She'd miss him more than John could ever understand. He looked after me since I was little. When I ran away, he risked his life to find me, nursed me back to health, and didn't leave my side once. And he just died trying to save Kyle, someone he didn't even know. That's the kind of guy he was. He always put everyone else before himself. John saw a flicker of moisture in her eyes and wondered what he should do. Anyone else he'd try to comfort, but he didn't think that would go down so well with her. Savannah didn't take kindly to being consoled. At least not by anyone but Ellison. And now he was gone, it was back to no one again. Seeing Savannah so broken and in pain broke his heart, and he just didn't know what to do to help. "Cameron and me are always here," he said to her. "If you need anything." Cameron handed her a canteen of water. "Drink it," she told her. There was no resistance from Savannah. She took the container from her hands and slowly, mechanically drank down a few mouthfuls before handing it back to Cameron. "We have to go," she told Savannah. "Take point and head south." The redhead nodded sullenly, and her expression hardened again. She blinked the beginnings of tears away and hard. Grim resolve set into her features, as well as a heightened sense of vigilance as she scoured the ground around her for any signs of machines and set off once more. "We're moving," Cameron told the rest of them. Immediately, they were up on their feet. Canteens were shoved back into pouches, and foil food wrappers were stuffed into pockets, as 8 pairs of boots and 4 paws started marching once more. After Savannah went Cooper and Myers, followed by Allison, Cassie, and Derek and Torrance, spread out in a long line. John and Cameron again took the rear and covered the group's 6. "Why did you tell Savannah to move on?" John asked her. She'd been pretty abrupt about it, literally just after offering her water. Seemed pretty callous to him. "To keep her busy," Cameron replied. She'd made her own conclusions about Savannah based on what she'd seen and what John had told her. Savannah had suspended grieving whilst they were still on mission and suppressed her emotions. If she grieved now, she might be unable to continue. She needed to be distracted. Cameron was saddened too by his death. John Henry had been attached to him, and those feelings were now hers. Ellison had also kept John safe when she couldn't. He had devoted his entire life after they'd gone to keeping Savannah safe and ensuring John goes safely back to the past. She understood that very well. She'd miss him too. John nodded, understanding and also surprised. Just when he thought he had Cameron figured out, she showed another side to herself. She'd understood Savannah better than he had. Savannah stretched out her stride and broke into a run once again, forcing the others behind her to pick up the pace to keep up with her. Her muscles ached and burned still and begged her to slow down and rest, and she could feel large blisters on the balls of and under the arches of her feet, but she ignored the pain and pushed herself onwards. She could rest when she was back in the past or dead. Behind her, she could hear the others' labored breathing as they struggled to push on, but she carried on unrelenting. John wanted to be back in 24 hours, and they'd have to move slower once they were back in the sewers under LA, so they had to pick up the slack here. The M32 was secured to her tightly, but the weapon's butt kept smacking her backside with each stride. It was almost like a beat keeping her going. She concentrated hard on keeping her pace, one foot in front of the other. Breathe. Avoid the loose rock. Watch the horizon. Anything to avoid thinking about Ellison. Watching him go back for Kyle, seeing the HK roar overhead and strafing with its plasma cannon, helpless to act as they disappeared in a roiling explosion of earth and superheated gas. She shook her head vigorously like a dog drying itself, shaking the image from her mind. One foot in front of the other. They carried on for miles through the endless, barren and rocky terrain, running up and down hills, through valleys, and going on in what seemed an infinite dead wilderness. It was so deserted, so lifeless and so cold, that they could have been on the moon. The faint sound of jet engines whined in the distance and rapidly grew closer. The sleek aircraft form shot up from a concealed valley, half a mile to their right, and tore towards them, straight towards them. HK, Cameron called out. She instantly pushed John to the ground and covered his body with hers, as the others all scattered and dived down and scrambled for whatever cover they could find. The HK's search beam lit up and cast its glow down on them as it soared overhead. It instantly caught Allison and Derek and lit them up like a Christmas tree. Derek shoved Allison as hard as he could, pushing her out of its beam, and he stared up at the thing, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop the inevitable plasma fire that would shatter his body and flash boil what was left in an instant. To his surprise, no shot came. The HK swept its beam across the ground and caught most of them. It shut the beam off and pulled up high into the air, leaving them be. "What the hell's it doing?" Allison shouted out, staring up at the thing, and, although grateful it hadn't killed Derek as well, she was suspicious why it had just left them alone like that. She'd never seen an HK act like that before. Cameron tracked its movement and watched it fly up into the air. It pulled up to an altitude of 5,500 meters, far out of range of any of their weapons. "It's tracking us," she said. Skynet wouldn't be able to track the redirected power from Serrano Point to Zyracorp because of the damage they'd caused. Instead, it had sent out units to hunt for them. Cameron thought it likely Skynet had mobilized almost every HK from Vandenberg Air Base to scour the area. "It's going to follow us." "So what do we do?" Torrance asked. "Split up," Derek said. "It can't follow all of us." John shook his head and looked up at the thing, barely visible high up in the darkening sky. Nightfall would come soon. "No, we'll have to meet up again eventually." We'd lead it straight back to Zyracorp. They needed to take it out and quickly. The HK wasn't firing at them, but he'd bet his right arm it was vectoring other units towards them, ready to follow wherever they go and attack once they got there. If they didn't get rid of the HK, soon the machines would cast a net from which they'd never get out. He looked out to the hills and valleys to their south. Some of them ran extremely high, and the valleys dipped down very low. One particular valley to the southeast ran several hundred meters below the steep hills on either side, and he could see from where he was that the valley was covered in rocky outcrops and structures they could hide in. He turned to look at Cameron and noted the RPG still slung over her back, and an idea came to mind. "Head into the valley down there," John pointed to where he'd been looking. "We run there, get in and split up. If the HK wants to track us, it'll have to fly in closer for a better look." He turned back to Cameron. "You run up to the top of the hill, lay low out of sight, and when it moves in close, take it out with the RPG." "That can work," she agreed with a small smile. He was thinking more and more like his future self. Though there was something he hadn't considered. "Shoot me," she told him. "What?" John stared at her, mouth agape with disbelief. "Why would I shoot you?" What the hell was she talking about? "Skynet sees what the HK sees," she explained. "If the HK sees me not following you, it could sense a trap. Skynet could take direct control of the HK and keep it out of harm's way, and keep it tracking them from a distance. Shoot me and Skynet will see it. It will think you killed me and moved on." "I'll do it." Allison enthusiastically raised her rifle. Derek also shouldered his plasma rifle and turned towards Cameron. "No." John pushed Allison's M4 barrel down and held his hand out at Derek, slowly shaking his head at them. He wasn't going to let them do anything to Cameron, especially not with a plasma rifle. And if Allison fired at Cameron, chances were she wouldn't stop. It was a good plan, and he knew it, but still he wasn't going to let them open up on her. "I'll do it," he said. Savannah stepped up and pulled one of her pistols out from its thigh holster. She handed it to John, and he pointed it at Cameron's chest, fingered the trigger, and hesitated, still holding the gun and shaking slightly. Cameron sensed his reluctance to shoot her. She knew he felt attached to her. She didn't say anything. She locked eyes with him and nodded once, telling him it was okay. John paused for a moment and took a breath. She was a Terminator. A 9mm couldn't do squat to her. He breathed out and tapped the trigger. The gun barked loudly in his hand, and the round tore through the air and struck Cameron in the forehead. She dropped like a stone and fell to the ground, where she lay unmoving. She looked up at John and winked once, then stared ahead at the ground. John gave the pistol back to Savannah and shouldered his battle rifle again. "Let's get moving," he told the others. He took off in a sprint to the south, tearing over the rocky terrain as fast as he could. Adrenaline surged through his system and pushed him on faster and harder. He barely even noticed the burning in his muscles, and he suddenly felt lighter than air. His boots barely seemed to touch the ground. Savannah followed close after him, as were Derek and the others as they made their way quickly down the low ground towards the edge of the valley. Soon the hills rose up above on either side of them and cast their shadows over the group in the failing light. "Split up," John told them as they went deeper into the valley, almost a canyon. The hills on either side were that steep. He looked back behind him and saw the HK was still on their tail. He pushed on forwards and saw that Savannah had veered off to the right, Derek to the left, and Torrance and Allison dashed on forwards behind him for 100 yards or so, before splitting up and disappearing into rock formations. John kept going straight forward until he saw the peaks of one hill above him. He saw a rocky dip in the ground to his right, just wide enough to fit inside. He scrambled for it and ducked down into it, curling up into a ball and looking upwards at the aircraft hovering above. Its searchlight beamed on again and swept through the valley, searching for them. There was no way the HK wouldn't see him hiding in it, but that didn't matter. He didn't want it to lose him. Quite the opposite, in fact. Cameron waited until the HK followed after John and the others, before she got up to her feet. As she'd told John before, she could feel, even pain of a sort. The bullet had bounced off her hyperalloy skull and fallen to the ground, but the burnt, torn flesh of her forehead was irritating. She sprinted out towards the hill on the right-hand side of the valley, where John was hiding. The HK flew lazily after them, and she tracked its movement, speed, and altitude as it followed. It descended lower as they moved deeper into the valley, and Cameron pushed herself as fast as she could go, significantly putting the fastest human athletes ever born to shame. She quickly accelerated to 26.43 miles per hour on smoother terrain. She'd be able to approach 30 mph, but having to avoid obstacles on the rocky ground slowed her slightly. Still, she moved so fast that she reached the base of the hill not long after John and the others started down into the valley. She watched the HK descend lower and activate its searchlight, hunting for them. She dashed up the hill and slowed down as she reached the top. She crouched low and got down on one knee as she put the plasma rifle down and unslung the RPG, positioning it over her shoulder and taking aim at the HK hovering overhead. It was now at an altitude of only 1,000 meters above her, having descended low to keep track of John and the others, down in the valley below. It was an extreme range for the primitive, Soviet-era weapon, and she knew exactly why John had selected her to fire it. She took aim through the sights and scented the crosshairs over the aircraft's fuselage. She pulled the trigger, and the rocket tore out of the launcher with a resounding whoosh and a fiery backblast behind her. The projectile shot through the air with a smoky plume and tore a straight line up into the air, taking several seconds to close the distance to the target. It smashed into the HK. The armor-piercing warhead penetrated through the thin aluminium hull of the aircraft and erupted inside it, blasting the fuselage apart like a firecracker inside a watermelon. The engines on either side were blown clean off their mounts, and the flaming, torn wreckage of the HK plummeted and smashed into the hillside, halfway down. The fuel tanks split open, and hydrogen burned as it flowed down the rocky hill like liquid fire. Cameron looked down the hillside and scanned for the others. "John!" She called out, searching for him in the darkness of the valley. Suddenly, she thought about all the burning shrapnel from the exploding HK. There was a chance he might have been hit, but it was more than too much for her. What if he's hurt? She asked herself. What if I've killed him? Cameron slung the rocket launcher over her back once more, snatched up the plasma rifle, and took off running down the hill. An overwhelming sense of urgency took over her, and she called out to him as she ran down. She jumped off a rocky ledge and plummeted 50 meters to the slope below. She bent her knees as she hit, and her legs absorbed the impact as the loose rocks beneath her flew outward from the force of her landing. She looked down at the valley floor below and identified Savannah, Myers, Allison, and Torrance starting to emerge from their hiding places, followed by Derek a few seconds later. She scanned for John frantically, feeling the closest thing she ever could to panic, switching between her modes of vision from normal to infrared and back again, trying to pick up another signature. Finally, she spotted a partial one in a large hole in the ground, obscured by more rocks above. She ran down into the valley towards it and switched her vision back to normal. "John!" She called out to him again as she approached. John stood up out of the small trench and looked at the wreckage all around. Part of one jet engine had hit the ground only a few meters away, and both John and Cameron immediately knew if it had been any closer, or if he hadn't hidden in the trench, he'd have been killed. "I'm sorry," she said to him. "I was reckless." She shouldn't have shot the HK down without knowing exactly where he was, although that was the only chance they were likely to have had. And logically, she knew now that where John was hiding was out of her field of vision up on the hilltop, and there'd be no way to verify it without giving herself away and allowing the HK to escape. She shouldn't have risked his life like that. She didn't know why she'd done it. She wouldn't let herself risk him again. She raised her hand to his neck and cupped his jaw in her palm, scanning him but also running her thumb along his face, feeling the stubble along his jawline that made him more closely resemble his future self. "I'm fine," John said to her. He reached up for her hand to pull it away, knowing what she was doing, but stopped once he had her hand in his. He took a moment and realized she was just concerned about him. She cared about him, and he let her carry on. Deep down, he realized he actually liked it, both her scanning and rubbing his jaw, and the fact she cared so much about him. He wondered. He'd come through time because of what she meant to him, and she'd said, before she could she feel the same way? "I don't want to lose you," Cameron said, ceasing her rubbing of his jaw and just cupping his face with her hand. "Is that my answer?" John wondered as he stared at her for a moment. Unconsciously, he grabbed her forearm and held it in place, turned his head towards her hand and gently brushed his lips against her palm, lightly kissing the pad at the base of her thumb and noting how soft and smooth her skin was even after a week of roughing it. He took a step closer and leaned down towards her face, closing his eyes as he parted his lips an inch away from hers. Savannah cleared her throat near them and snapped John back to reality. He quickly let go of Cameron's hand and turned towards her, looking around to see if anyone else had seen him and her. He could hardly believe what he'd almost done, right out in the open. Stupid John, he chided himself. What if someone else had seen that? He thought, dreading what the response to that might be. "All clear," Savannah said, turning away from them as Derek approached. "Nice shot," Derek conceded to Cameron. He had to admit, none of them could have made it. He'd used similar anti-tank rockets before, and the HK looked like it had been just on the edge of its range. Another 50 meters further away, and the missile would have just cooked off and exploded harmlessly. That was pretty good. Torrance nodded to her, impressed. One advantage of having metal with them, he supposed. The group got back into formation with Savannah at the front again, and John and Cameron at the back. But this time, Savannah set a quick march rather than a dead run, and they made their way nervously, forward eyes darting left and right and up into the surrounding hills, searching for signs of any more machines lurking as they marched out of the valley and back into the vast network of hills. Cameron led the way through the tunnel, using her flawless recollection of the route she'd taken after arriving in the future to navigate through the complex system of basements, sub-basements, and sewers. Derek, Allison, and the others knew the way just as well, but she'd insisted on taking the point position in case any machines were stalking through the tunnels. John was behind her, and he noticed as the sewer system gave way to a series of tunnels that started to seem more familiar. The ground was wet and dank, and the last time he'd been here his feet had been bare. His boots stamped down into stagnant, shitty brown water on the ground, and he found himself glad that he was better attired for his return to this charming little part of the city. Finally, their destination came into sight, the collapsed wall that gave way to Zyracorp's basement, where his entire ordeal had started. He wasn't even sure how long he'd been in the future for now. It felt like he'd spent an entire lifetime in the future, and the past seemed like little more than a distant memory. But now the promise of going back was only 50 yards away, just behind that wall. He heard the low, thrumming whine of the TDE before he even entered the room. As he stepped inside, he saw Weaver standing in the middle of the room, typing on the laptop, balanced on a liquid metal shelf sticking out from her stomach. "You're back," Weaver commented as John and Cameron entered, followed by the others as they filtered into the room. She didn't look up from what she was doing and didn't sound particularly interested, as if they'd only been gone a few minutes to get a newspaper from the corner store. "Is it ready?" John asked her. He wasn't surprised by her indifferent attitude at all. He'd learnt she was strictly business. No consideration for anything else but the job in hand, and she'd already made it clear that all the others were nothing more than expendable assets in her eyes. He even reckoned that if he or Cameron were killed, she'd just fire up the TDE and go back a few minutes before the event, snatch their 10 minutes or so ago selves, and use the machine in that time to go back to the past. So technically, even they were expendable, he thought. 38 minutes, Weaver told him. John leaned back against the wall, and his legs sagged beneath him. He slid down until he was sat on his backside on the floor, exhausted. He unclipped his webbing and pulled a water canteen from one of the pouches, took off the cap and swigged it all down. "Might as well rest for half an hour," John told everyone else. The Serrano Point mission had been a week's round trip. The return had been 2 days of constant marching with only one 5-minute rest, just before the HK had appeared. After that, they'd quick marched an hour at a time, followed by half an hour of running. He was exhausted, to say the least, and he could see the toll it had taken on the others, as they too flopped down onto the ground and dug out the last droplets of water from their canteens. Cameron stood upright and still held her plasma rifle. Until they were back in 2009, she wouldn't be satisfied John was safe. Savannah sat down in one corner and felt the vibrations against her back from one of the electromagnets, still beneath the concrete, as it gathered power slowly. She hadn't listened to Weaver's explanation of how the TDE was supposed to work, partly because she had no interest in anything the liquid metal freak had to say, and also because science just wasn't her thing. Advanced quantum physics, or whatever the hell it was called, went right over her head. She didn't need to know what made it work, just as long as it did. She noticed a foot sticking out from the hole in the wall where the exposed electromagnetic tower was located, and decided to get up and investigate. She saw the dead body of a tunnel rat laid out on the ground with a large red stab wound in the chest. She could see the breastbone just underneath the neat, surgically precise incision and saw that it had been cleaved in half. Weaver's handiwork for sure, she thought. She stared at the T-1001, and her hand unconsciously slid down to the pistol on her thigh holster. She wouldn't put it past the bitch to slaughter everyone she didn't deem as absolutely necessary, and that included her. "I'm gonna sleep for a month when we get back," Torrance groaned as he took out a strip of dried meat from a foil back and stuffed it into his mouth. "And eat everything in sight," Myers said with a grin. "First stop, McDonald's." Derek looked at Myers with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror on his face. "Seriously, McDonald's?" He stared in disbelief. "What?" Myers looked at him, confused. "Your first real meal, 16 years and you're gonna eat McDonald's. Might as well stick to dead rats and algae." "So what are you gonna have, Reese?" Torrance asked. Derek lipped his lips at the thought. He'd already given this some serious consideration and already knew his answer. "When Kyle and I were kids, we'd play baseball in the park on Saturdays, and there was always this guy with a hot dog stand there. Best I ever tasted." His mouth was practically watering already from the thought, and his stomach grumbled. He ignored it used to being starving. It was almost a steady-state condition for them all. What he couldn't ignore was the pain he felt at the memories, knowing Kyle wouldn't be there with him to play ball or eat hot dogs together. As painful as it was for him, he looked to Allison sat alone in another corner and realized it was probably worse for her. She and Kyle only had a short time together, but he'd watched both of them growing up and getting closer. He was surprised it had taken them that long to hook up. But now that had been torn from Allison, and she was all alone again, save for Cassie. The dog sat faithfully by her mistress, her head and paws resting on Allison's thigh. "What about you?" he asked Allison. "What's your first meal gonna be?" "I don't care," she said quietly. She wasn't bothered what they'd eat. It would all taste pretty much the same without Kyle there. She didn't want to think of food now anyway. She poured the last of the water into the palm of her hand and let Cassie eagerly lick it up, lapping loudly with her tongue before Allison wiped it off on her trousers after the dog had finished. John saw Cameron stood sentinel at the entrance to the room, facing outwards away from them. He got up back to his feet and stood next to her, trying to see what she was staring at. All he could see was vacant, empty tunnels. "What is it?" John asked nervously. He strained his ears and heard a low rumbling from above. "Centaur Patrol," Cameron replied. She could hear its heavy tracks up above them on the surface as it rolled along the ground. "They patrol here all the time," Derek shrugged. "There are more vehicles," Cameron said. She could hear not just tracks, but what sounded like several sets of wheels as well. "Come with me," she told John. "Bring your weapons." John nodded nervously and clipped his webbing back on, slid the straps over his shoulders and pulled the slings for both the HK-417 and the AA-12 over him. He turned to the others. "Stay here, we'll be back." Together John and Cameron bolted out of the basement and back through the sewer tunnels, splashing filthy water beneath them with each step. John still felt exhausted from the trek and could barely believe he could still run. He felt like his body was going to fall apart any moment. "What are we looking for?" he asked her between ragged, shallow breaths. "Manhole cover," Cameron answered as she continuously swept the ceiling above them for any sign of one they could use. They tried one, but it was under a ton of debris, and Cameron didn't even attempt to push against it. They continued on until they were roughly 2 blocks from the Zyracorp basement and found another manhole. The ladder leading up to the surface had been damaged, and the upper rungs were missing. The top of the tunnel was slightly over 8 feet high, and although she could jump that she had nothing to hold on to beneath the manhole cover, the hole in the ceiling below it being made of smooth concrete. "I need a lift up," she said. John crouched down on one knee in front of her, and cupped his hands over the kneecap of his left leg. Cameron placed one of her feet into the palms of his hands and pushed up as John raised himself, lifting her up higher until she could reach out and steady herself on the concrete ledge just below the metal cover. John felt himself straining under her weight. She wasn't really any heavier than a normal girl would be, but he'd been on the move for a week, constantly on the run for 2 days, and hadn't eaten a thing for 3. Hunger and fatigue were taking their toll. "Hold it there," Cameron gently told him as she reached up and slowly pushed the manhole cover upwards. She pushed it up out of the way and clutched onto the ground above with both hands as she pulled her body upwards until her head poked out the top of the hole and she could see above the surface. She looked around and saw nothing in her immediate field of vision. Rubble obscured her view to some extent, so she lifted her whole body clear of the tunnel and crawled slowly towards the sounds of tracks and wheels rolling slowly. Her oral senses were far superior to any living creatures apart from perhaps bats, and she instantly identified the source of what she was hearing and matched sound patterns to those in her flawless memory. The results weren't promising. She poked her head up above the rubble to make a visual ID. Beyond the rubble, some 200 meters away down the road, was the shattered stump of the Zyracorp Tower. It had been sheared in half by the nuclear blasts, and the skeletal steel frames stuck out from the crumbling concrete walls. The base was surrounded by piles of rubble from the top half of the skyscraper, where it had collapsed in on itself. On the road, just down from the obliterated remains, a Centaur and 2 armored troop carriers, plus their towed trailers, were parked. Hatches on the sides of the vehicles were open, and machines stepped outside, wielding plasma rifles. Some armed with 2 each, whilst others only held 1. High in the air above them, 3 HKs hovered, covering the ground units. There was only one reason so many machines would have been mobilized to this sector of downtown LA, and why they were assembled directly above them. Skynet had found them. Cameron backed away towards the manhole and lowered herself down, placing the cover as quietly as she could back into place before she dropped down to face a nervous and expectant John. "What's going on?" he asked, knowing it couldn't be good. Cameron looked at John and allowed her face to express to him the urgent worry she felt. "We have company,"